It's actually really, really exciting to see the group here. So many of you are very familiar to me, and truly people I have learned most of what I know from. So really exciting to be and to really find the time equally to put, you know, thoughts that you have assimilated over a long time into some structure and cohesion. Um, I want to thank Anu for triggering this because it's been a while since even I have intentionally thought about this. So I'll dig right in, but just a few things to say to pick up from where Gautam left. I am no expert on systems thinking at all. You will find people who have more or less studied this their entire life, read all the theories that are there. I've read a little, but most of what I have honestly learned and gathered has come from my time with Ashoka, which, I think my time there both introduced me to the concept of systems thinking, but the process of working with Ashoka fellows who are actually leading the change is actually really where most of what I'm going to share with you today is. And maybe some versions or iterations from there that I have gone through with my own personal journey and my time at Agami. So it's really an assimilation of that sort. And in that sense, would really like a lot of you in this room have maybe driven system change to different extent, or seen it with much closer quarters. So let's just use this. I'll present some ideas which might just help trigger some conversation, but would love to hear each of your thoughts. I'm going to share my screen. Second. Can you all see my screen? How is it pretty or not pretty?
Yep, can see.
Okay, so dive straight in. So yeah, so today I thought we'll just discuss like three things, and it felt like a lot to cover with just that. The first part is what is a system? And because that feels so fundamental before we can even talk about, where we drive change or where are the problems in it or what we want to do about it. The second part of the conversation is really what do we want to see in it, and relates to the problem identification component. And the third is then what do I want to do about it? Because each of these things are an end in themselves. Sometimes just seeing, you can feel closure doing one bit of it, but each of our journeys link to these three questions in completely different ways. So I thought it was a useful way to structure three bits. And after we discuss each part, we will take some time to discuss as a group, and then we'll go into the second and third segments of the session. So very quickly, this was maybe, I'm sure there are several definitions out there, but the one that really sat with me is that it is a system of interconnected elements that is organized in a way that achieves something. And that left me to sort of think that there are really three big parts that we're talking about, right? When we're talking about a system. The first is what we call as the elements in a system. The elements are maybe the most obvious ones for most of us to sort of look at. Like if you're looking at a school system, it's the teachers, it's the principal, it's the student, it's the people, so actors in some way. But equally, the intangible dimension of an element, right? Like school pride, like how you feel about like being, a part of a certain school, or you don't feel a part of a pride. Like those are also elements that each of the individual actor feel. Or academic prowess, like NPS is known for certain things, and that's an element of that system, right? So even those intangible dimensions are critical part of a system. So that's like the first ingredient. So if you're making a cup of tea, like that's the first thing that you need to look for are what are the elements, both tangible and intangible in it. And this is something that I have seen people when they're talking about their work, not as consciously talk about them as elements, but you can hear them often talking, this is what the student is, this is what the teacher is, there is this element of a parent, etc. Right? So in essence, what we're talking about are the elements in the system. The second is the connections between the elements of the system. And again, these can be tangible and intangible. So interconnectedness can be everything. For example, if it's a tree, the way the roots and the leaves are connected are through both chemical reactions, processes, and signals that, if the leaves are a little extra dry, then, the roots get a signal to sort of suck water out of the root. These are the ways in which different elements sort of speak to each other. And I think this is actually a really interesting thing because often we look at the individual elements and their dimensions, but their connections are actually paramount, not often easy to see, but it's basically the relationships that hold them together, right? Like what makes them something that comes cohesively together is the interconnectedness. Um, and for example, to take it out of an abstract example like a tree, if you were to take, again, extending on the university system itself, the admission process, like on what basis are we saying students are a fit to a system or not, is a part of the connection between the school and the student, or on how do we grade them, or how does budget flows. All of these are things that help connect different elements of the system. Who gets like what are the pay grades? Those affect the interconnectedness of the elements in a system, right? And often even the communication of the purpose of a system. Like if there are courses in a college that people believe, you know, will affect something that affects how an element, if I believe that studying, say, constitutional law will have this effect on me, it's also the communication that is given to me that affects how the elements react and respond to each other. So I always find it interesting to also like look at what are the connections between the different elements in the system. Some are very tangible and real, but some, like I mentioned, are intangible. And the third one is actually the purpose of a system, which is a really interesting one to look at because it is not a system unless there is a purpose that puts it together. For example, and this is something that I find useful to look at less in terms of what is the rhetorical statement made about the purpose of a system. I'll give you our own example as Agami, right? Like last year, we said one of our biggest purposes was to attract investment for the sector. But truth be told, when we were actually looking at where we put our own efforts, time, and money, it wasn't actually towards that as a goal. So it might have very well been that on the paper we have said that, or even may have communicated it here and there. But in behavior, we didn't actually behave like that was a purpose that we were driven by. So and this is things that we all also might find true individually in our life, and we equally found it in national systems, right? For example, if the government says environment is a high priority, but they're either not putting their money behind it or time behind it, it can be a well-stated statement, but that doesn't actually reflect its true purpose. So I always find it more interesting to look at what is the system, whichever system we are looking at, its actual behavior, and to deduct the purpose from that, instead of sort of starting with saying this is what the stated purpose is and trying to retrofit everything around that dimension, right? So and it's also equally true when we're talking about purpose, for example, that sometimes it forces us to think, why do we have sometimes purposes that seemingly nobody wants, right? Like if you look at if you go based on behavior, it would feel fair to conclude that crime is a purpose of certain systems, right? Or drug addiction is a purpose of certain systems, or war is a purpose of some systems. And then it might be seemingly like, it makes no sense that that is actually what anybody will intend to want or explicitly want. But I think this is the place where I find that the elements play a bigger role when you look at purpose in this regard. For example, the individual purpose, every element also has a purpose of its own, right? Like, for example, if my purpose is to just get quick relief from mental health issues I'm facing, I might want to do drugs. So it might not be explicitly the system's purpose from the start, but my individual purpose of wanting quick relief coupled with someone else's immediate purpose based on behavior around wanting to make a quick buck might result in a system, that is crime or addiction based, rather than something that someone has intentionally put on paper, as a purpose to the system. So, and this is where it is also interesting to see when you're looking at a system and its elements, that all these three elements are connected. How does the purpose of the elements sit in harmony with the whole? Because of the individual parts stand with the whole. So that is something that's always a question that I find interesting to observe in both ideas I'm interested in and in the work that we are doing. But those are the three, like any system that you're talking about, if you're defining it as a system, it will by necessity have these three elements, right? For example, if I just throw sand on the road, you know, that is not a system because it is not interconnected. Like I can remove a part of a sand and makes no difference, and it is not there for any real purpose. I mean, it depends if you're putting it for the context of laying a road, it's completely different. But in another context, that is actually not a system. So very quickly, if you move with these three elements, what you might see is there are, if we just take the digestive system itself is a system. Its purpose is to sort of help with digestion of food. It has different elements, everything from the mouth to saliva to like the stomach to the intestines. Those are the elements, and they are all interconnected to be able to communicate, different dimensions, both of health, of overeating and like of allergy, etc., among in and within themselves. And extending the same logic, you'd see that the entire human body is also a system. I think you'll see all the three elements in each of these. A classroom, which is a group of many individual human bodies, is also a system because you have people, there are relations between the students, between the teacher and the student, and they're all there for the purposes of like each classroom might articulate it differently, but of like, advancing knowledge or learning outcomes for the children. A same way, a city is also a system taken to a much larger scale. And then if we were to go even one step bigger, the planet is a system. And this is why it's actually a really fascinating and interesting thing to look at because, who decides where you want to look and what is the right way to look at. Just some things that I wanted to clarify is in many of my conversations, I have seen people interchangeably talk about systems as if it's only about changing government and policy. I have come to accept and embrace that that is actually completely not what it is. We all have a predisposition to think that that's the only way to actually drive systemic change. But there is no reason, or at least I can't find a clear argument for that conclusion and that very strongly prevailing mindset around that. The other interesting thing that I have witnessed from, all my years of working both at Ashoka and now at Agami, when I'm working with like people who are driving system change, is most of them have actually never formally sat down to map a system. They haven't actually gone saying, okay, I want to drive systems change, and here are the actors, and created a Lego model of it and drawn connections of that form. We might have done it at different parts, but at least to the best that I know, that isn't where most of their work emerged. And I find this personally very, very reassuring because twice I think I have sat in formal systems changing workshop, and I'd love to hear what all your experiences are. And it's not left me, it's sometimes left me more confused, or sometimes not left me with something as actionable as some other experiences I have had. So it's just a question I wanted to raise to see if anyone had been a part of something that was a formal process that actually was a revealing process for them in terms of guiding their course and action. And I'm just curious to learn that. The second is clearly it's not a science in the sense that there is no one person who can tell you that, oh, if you haven't included XYZ, you haven't fully seen a system. Like, no, if you're only looking at your classroom, that's not enough. Your classroom, it needs to be these set of classrooms or all these schools, where you want to draw your boundary to the system, or, what the elements are, etc. I find it to be a hard conversation if someone tells me this is how they're seeing it, for me to fully push back and say, no, that is wrong. And this is, the only way that one must see it, and that leads me to the last point, which is, and that is because I think the person needing and looking for this change is intrinsically linked to the system change process. Because I think where we choose to draw our boundaries, and again, I take my own personal example here. At Agami, we have taken the stance that we are looking at the legal and justice system, and we have drawn seemingly very artificial boundaries to it, right? Like we have said, It includes anything and anything that directly affects or changes the justice system, which is say court, police, prisons, legal profession. We have boundaried those within certain elements that we think are important and certain connections. It will be very easy for all of you to say, justice is intrinsically linked to gender and then to disability and to environment, and therefore you should be looking at all of these. Sure, that's the case. But equally, there can be another group of people who can say that, it's you just need to look at prisons and that itself is enough. And there are organizations and individuals who take that focus. And which is why I think it has a lot to do with what the personal interest, aspiration, and almost like experience of the person trying to look at the system. If you are, the classic thing that you are as much a subject of the system you are looking at, like you can't pull yourself out of it and map. If you are mapping it, you are intrinsically a part of that mapping process. And I have found it personally liberating to make peace with that and to learn that through my experience, to not look for, is this right? Are we too narrow? Are we too broad? Kind of a question. So I'll stop here before we go into the next bit, but curious to just hear all your reactions and, thoughts or even ideas on just relating to what a system is.
If you want to use the raise hand button on this thing, I can unmute you guys.
Should I stop sharing my screen in the meantime so then we can see everybody? Okay.
Supriya, there are a few questions and thoughts on chat. Anu's first question was around the boundary of the system. I think you answered that when you talked about the fact that the perspective of the change maker matters, and and your experience with Agami. There were a few other questions around the interconnectedness and transboundary elements, which I think again goes back to the question of what are the boundary conditions for a system. I don't know. Do you want to just go back to that, Supriya, for a short while, just around how do you draw the boundary conditions for your own system that you all work on? I think the Agami example would be useful, and then we can ask if anyone had thoughts on that too.
Sure. And I mean, this is something that I'm really curious. This is where I have landed up. And really, it's not the last word on it, but it is true that there is nothing in the world that is actually not connected to each other, right? That's a strong belief I have, both at a spiritual level and in terms of when you lead life, you actually see that is the reality. And like everything from anthropology, history, behavioral science, design, technology, it is really hard to actually draw these boundaries, but we draw these boundaries for our own internal clarity, not for any other purposes. So what I find interesting, there is no legitimate boundary, but it makes complete sense for us to draw them nevertheless, for just our own sense-making process of the universe. And for example, if you're working on, say, traffic problems, if you don't account for, say, where human settlements are, like where basically people are living nearby, you might not be factoring in a lot how, movement might work or not. Like if you don't take something that might not be seemingly related to mobility, but like where people are staying, but it has a connection to it, right? And what I have found is, whether you take an academic or a purely political boundary, especially when you're working on environmental systems, political and state boundaries sometimes don't make any sense. The academic boundary of whether it needs to be psychology, design, history, law, also sometimes really fail us at many, many ways. And where we landed at for Agami also, it's really coming back to that question of like, who are we and what is it that interests, inspires, and excites us to solve? For example, if my blood only like really, really bled for prison work, maybe I would have drawn my boundary there. But for me, based on my interest, my background, it was a field that did interest. And sure, you can make an argument, but like that, I think like this first, the personal area of interest, things that we have been looking at, been thinking about affect where we choose to draw our systems. But if we agree that boundaries are our own making, then I also think that the way I make peace with it is that we can and we should reconsider them when we need to do it. So for example, if there is a moment, we are working on an issue and the gender lens becomes very critical or the environmental justice becomes very critical, I can't at that moment become really hard bound to my own initial boundary that I might have set for whatever reason to looking at that issue. So I think where I have landed at is more like having the mental flexibility to be able to, if a situation, like because there is always this overarching idea and there are sub ideas that you're always working on, to have the mental flexibility to sometimes further narrow your boundary or further expand that boundary based on what you feel is needed. Sometimes when I've been a part of like systems thinking exercises, you find that in the process of defining the system, you tend to go really broad to say, oh, but this is also connected, this is also connected. But I find that personally paralyzing because I don't know then where to sort of start. But equally, like taking an extremely narrow view also sort of can be limiting. So I think the two things I would say is really trust your own, the reason why you are looking at it, and if you treat yourself as a subject there is, and because you're not doing this as an academic exercise, you're doing this because you want to act on it or you want to work with people who are acting on it. So it feels to me very reasonable to say, bring in your own like perspective into where you feel comfortable drawing it. But then have the mental flexibility if you recognize along the way that, this is either extremely narrow or extremely too broad to be able to adapt to that.
Thanks, Supriya. The other question that has come up a couple of times is on the idea of the purpose of a system versus the function of the system. You also talked about it in terms of what you see the system perform versus what the intention of the system is. So if you just wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's a crucial distinction, the purpose of a system versus the intent of a system, and they can be very different things.
Yeah. So yeah, and this is honestly a fairly fresh thought in my head, and I thought it's worth putting it out there. To be honest, it's not something that I have thought for a long time, but I think firstly the word function and purpose. Usually, I have found people use the word function when it relates to more technology or inanimate objects, like what is their function, and usually when there are strong human dimensions, they use the word purpose. But in my head, I don't see a big distinction. For the context, I think I'm using the word function and purpose interchangeably. But the reason why I felt it's good to look, if our process of inquiry comes from a place of understanding the system to see where its problems and where our action is, I find it more useful to look at what its actual behavior is rather than what its stated is, because I have not found the stated intention revealing to me. So it's also to the context of the exercise we're doing. It might not be in a different context. Purpose might not mean based on actual behavior, but to the exercise that we are doing, I find it useful because it reveals much more of what the problem is, what potentially the connections are, why the system behaves actually the way it does. Because if I say the Constitution of India says this, everything looks hunky-dory, and from there on we should have no problems, right? Like, what the executive should do, what the judiciary should do, what the legislature should do. But we all know that that is not on the basis of which the world functions. And if I actually have a problem with the way the system is functioning now, I need to get a glimpse into what its purpose is based on its behavior, rather than what someone might have set in stone at some point of time, which is the same thing. We can all look at our own organizations. We say our culture is XYZ, but in reality, it might be something else. So we can say our purpose was to do this, but if we haven't actually effectuated that, then that gives us a clue of where the problem might lie from there.
Thanks. Did anyone have any comments, questions, thoughts? Remember, this is a discussion.
Yeah, so we'd love to really hear if any of you have other ideas or reflections on this.
There are some thoughts and questions on the chat as well. I'm raising the questions, but the thoughts are also really important. Anna, Marianne, thank you so much for that stuff as well. If any of you want to chime in, please feel free to. Supriya, do you want to go on?
We'll take it up from there, then we'll go. Yeah. But it'd be lovely to hear even stories of why you are landed up where you are, because sometimes it's equally useful to hear that. So I'll take it on from here. Sorry, what was happening? I'm not really great at handling this system. Okay, here we go. So if it is not through a formal, mapping process, etc., then where can we get our clues from, right? Because sometimes it can also feel really overwhelming that it all comes down to me, and especially when we are starting out, we don't trust our own instincts as much, right? Like we are always second guessing ourselves. Have I seen enough? Have I looked at different dimensions? And what I thought I would do is share like really the one thing that I have learned is it all comes down, at least like for me, in how we have understood the problem, and seeing the problem, and the systemic problem more so is actually at the heart of where the change process begins from. And I use the word seeing in a very, very intentional way, which is not just a literal act of like, oh, I see you, but like sometimes see well beyond what might also be apparent than what meets the eye. So, and this is a classic case of sometimes, once a person lifts the wheel on something, it becomes so obvious that, you can't almost unsee it. And some of the stories I'm going to be sharing right now relate to just some of those experiences that I have had or what I have taken away from the journey of other social entrepreneurs. So if we look at like I don't know how many of you, I think fairly assume that most of you would have heard the word Maria Montessori or like have heard of her work. But for me, like her work is always something I go back to, because I think it's rare that you see something as profound as the insights that she has had, also that are so timeless and, and things that have shaped like generations of people to come in so many ways. For those of you who are not as familiar with her work, she's basically an educationist, who was deeply dissatisfied with the way, the education system was, the way children were learning, the way people were taught. And she spent years of her life. Each of their work is like hours of conversation work, but I'll tell you the elements that stick most with me. But was just like literally observing a small group of 10, 15 children, like in Italy way back in the 1800s. She basically observed them without any judgment. And for me, this was actually like one of the most profound capabilities she had, was to see children as they were. And what she noticed is actually children have an innate desire to learn, and as she would call work. This was actually deeply in contradiction with what most educationists at that point of time thought, because people felt children had to be disciplined and made to sit down to sort of learn. But she figured that actually there is an innate need. Left to themselves, children are always like doing whatever their version of work is, and mainly what our role should be to make sure that teachers and classrooms are enabling that learning process for them. This, in a way, turned on its head. This observation, right? Like literally seeing this is actually what turned the entire, and there are a few more principles, of course, on the basis of which her work is laid on. But if the minute she saw these two things, the entire premise of her work, what she did, how she did it, radically changed in comparison to what anybody else had done, and radically changed what the outcomes were for a child, for a teacher, and for a parent, right? So it's literally this act of like being able to distance yourself and suspend and see things as they are. And and she saw a problem that was seemingly so obvious, because now I think any of you who have a child will also sort of see this along the way, and people who have sort of been exposed to this pedagogy also now can very easily see it. Let me move it to the next. And then an example much closer home and far more recently, are two, they're also Ashoka Fellows, Abhay and Rani Bang. But what I found incredibly wonderful about their journey and their act of seeing was, though they both were like, they literally like graduated from John Hopkins, so like were, medical professionals with the highest academic like degree. But when they went to Gachirauli, to the villages, they literally went and held what they call people assemblies, asking people what their health problems were, what their challenges were, etc. And what is fascinating is they could have taken a really clinical approach to that process, and said like, okay, here's a survey, here is what we have from the health records, etc. But when they did that kind of a people assembly exercise, they found that, many women many villagers actually said, oh, we don't go to that hospital, even though it's relatively nearby. Because they were just asking elementary questions. Again, not making any assumptions about anything. They asked, okay, there is a hospital, why don't you go? And they were like, no, the villagers were like, the doctors there wear white, and white is the death color of death, where we come from. And for us, it's inauspicious to go when you're sick, being around those colors. And so on and so forth, issues around the design of hospital, how it did accommodate relatives to come in. And in the process of all that engagement, that led them, it's that process of, again, open listening and seeing that allowed them to really do what I believe is one of the most revolutionary things that have happened in the Indian healthcare system of having, barefoot, like basically people who are not doctors. They got their first few groups of women were even giving injections and administering healthcare beyond just like awareness and vaccination. And that was a radical thing to do, but their engagement allowed them to sort of challenge the assumption that there is no reason to believe only a doctor needs to sort of like be able to do certain things, but even ordinary women can deliver healthcare. And a big part of our ASHA healthcare system is derived from their work from there on. I'll take an example of, because system change is also not always seemingly positive and like good, right? Like Osama bin Laden, I think, did something incredibly, and I don't know if it was somewhere before him, but something that I have read is really what he changed radically was how Al-Qaeda was organized. So he didn't necessarily change the mission, etc., but they organized themselves in a way where practically you can take out any cell and another cell will replace it. So, even if like the forces, like basically the military would take years of a task force to be able to put out a unit and, celebrate it as a success, but literally within 24 hours, another unit would replace it. And that was because Al-Qaeda was organized as, where literally everybody was number three. They had extremely fluid structures of working, incredible forms of communication between teams, and an incredibly agile and adaptable method. So what he really changed was the structure of how they were organized that allowed them to grow and permeate our worlds and life in ways that, you don't necessarily see permeating other solutions that may be more positive, permeating the same way. The concept of open prisons. I don't know how many of you have heard this, but most people I know who have encountered, like even I went to law school and hadn't heard of them for like my entire time there. But the idea of open prisons was created by, literally this is an innovation that came from within the government, but we've always looked at the prison system and all the problems it sort of manifests, right? Like we talk about how it makes people unemployable, how it sometimes increases crime, what it does for the children and family who remain outside. And there have always been people who have in a programmatic way tried sort of solving these problems. But a group of people, and I truly haven't been able to find who was the father of this, because I could find predated ideas like in different parts of the world, or father or mother of this idea. But what you can find is today in different parts of the world, there is this concept of an open prison, which is premised, and what they challenged or were able to see, they were able to see that the problem is not employment, skilling, which is what usually is the seen problem of a system. They were able to see that actually at the heart of the problem was that the entire prison system was built around the premise of distrust. Because when you build a premise on distrust, you have all the surveillance, you have all the security, then people can't work, people are disconnected from their families, and then all the multiplier effects from there on, right? So they flipped it on its head and said what would happen, and they could see that they saw that the premise of the system was based on distrust, and redesigned an entire system that was based on trust, where prisoners can walk in, walk out, of a prison in a day, and to the point that there are some eviction drives that are also happening in prisons, which I always find that as a fascinating thing to say. This is a system that can also work and be a reality. Prashanta Tripathi, not as well known, but is someone I find deeply, deeply inspiring. He went as a doctor again in Madhya Pradesh, and while he was working with the tribals, he found that what he saw again was women would come to him with their children a little too late, and most of them were the children were just dropping dead on his doorstep. And he didn't just see it as a problem of, oh, maybe we need nurses and hospitals closer. What he really saw at the heart of the problem was incredible sense of fatalism and an acceptance amongst the tribal community that it is normal for children to die. Like they hadn't even, you know, and they stopped having what you call as he called it critical thinking skills, and it was not a term usually used in the healthcare context because it's always seen as health awareness. But he said critical thinking skills is actually paramount. If you're a mother, if you can't identify when your child is sick and identify early enough and to judge when you need to take your child to a doctor, that is the problem, not where the nurses or where the doctor is or, you know, other dimensions. And because he saw those two problems, what he again did was completely different. Like, for example, they literally use storytelling as a way to build critical thinking skills amongst mothers. And clinical trials have showed that death has actually come down significantly. The last data I remember was like by 30%, you know, in the villages. So if you see the essence of what most of them are bringing in, is really the duality of life, right? Is this act of seeing is there is things that we know, and often we map, understand, and work with systems based on what that is, but they equally hold on to and are cognizant to what we do not know, and like but that we actually don't know nearly enough that we need to know. And it's a constant space of learning, right? And you call them blind spots, you call them whatever else, but I think I find it fascinating to see that at the heart of this entire process is you know, this duality of what are we able to see in the system, etc. So um, I based on these examples, I'll share like a few takeaways that might not seem as abstract because now it might feel like, you know, here are incredible people they saw, but how do I see it, right? Like, and the truth is, I don't know if there is an answer, and it's a question I'm grappling with myself. But what I see them doing often is taking, you know, taking our eyes off short-term events to look for long-term behavior and structures. So if we ask ourselves, what is when we're once you have your elements, you know, you have your interconnections and systems, and whatever way you want to sort of hold them in your minds. I find useful question to ask is what is long-term behavior? What are the structures around which these are built? So if you see the behavior dimension, both Prashanta's example relates to behavior, or even Maria Montessori's example, that behavior that children actually do want to learn. And you, when you look at it over a sense of time, it gives you certain insights about the system that you might not always have, because our tendency is often to look at what meets the eye. Or to look at structures, Osama bin Laden, or classroom structures that have changed, you know, are good examples of sort of saying, what would it look like if we were to be able to change that? The second thing is that really comes down to awareness again of false boundaries and bounded rationality. We spoke about boundaries, you know, like a little earlier about where something ends, where something begins. And I think the more we become aware that these are boundaries that we have drawn and we need to sort of test them constantly. If we feel extremely stuck, like if we are doing something for a really long time and we are not seeing the proportionate impact, it might be a good time to ask ourselves, have we drawn the boundaries falsely? You know, are there connections to this that we haven't seen before? And equally bounded rationality, right? This comes back to the point of we don't know what we don't know. But to be cognizant, even if we have done 10, 15, 20 years of work, that there is so much we don't know. And I think I found the most incredible people who have done systems change are able to hold that. They don't slip into what I call the expert mode, but are able to hold that learning dimension of themselves. And the reason why I think it's important to look at that is, you know, people like Adam Smith said, oh, if we are all rational, we all have the information. And if we have information, we will only create a system that is for the good of all. But we all know that that isn't the reality, right? Because there is fundamentally, we see the world only with the mental models we have. And we gain what we gain from our direct experiences. But as long as we can remain cognizant that there are several other mental models that are out there and other lived realities and perspectives, and we want to engage with them, it allows then for us to go from our individual perspective to truly having what I would call a systems perspective, because you get to a place of having a vantage point only when you're able to see all the other mental models and realities that are out there, or as many more than what you can if you're individually. Like just a week ago, we were speaking to the social entrepreneur who's working on like cross-border criminal investigation. And like he was completely, he had spent equal amount of time understanding people who were trafficking, people who were money laundering, and he had really interesting insights. He said, for example, most people in his experience, people trafficking did not consider themselves to be misogynist. They thought they were doing their own version of helping people get employment and saving them from whatever reality that they had. And I think these insights into behavior, intention, and purposes equally help you see. Like, so I think the simple point of time says, if you want to go from what is Supriya seeing to if I really want to see the system, I need to be able to get past what my own mental model is to see it from other perspectives. Equally, our ability to sort of recognize the non-linearities and delays that exist in the system. For example, and we'll see this at every level of the system, right? You can eat X amount, and then that last one, cupcake you ate can make you feel sick. It can have a disproportionate impact because there is a delay in the feedback loop in the system. And it's not necessary that every one input creates a corresponding one output. Input outputs are not always linear. If it is not linear at a body level, it gets infinitely more complicated and disproportionate at a larger system level. So how do we, you can see this with soil erosion also, right? Like for a long time, we might not have paid attention to soil erosion, but the minute topsoil starts getting eroded, then the non-linear impact of that is much higher than what would have happened before. So our ability to see those connections, predict them to whatever extent, might also really help us. Equally, not just focus on the what is happening, but the why it is happening. The more we can suspend our judgment and ask why, and from as many elements and actors as possible, it will help us see more than what we see. And lastly, I think it all comes down really with all of these things require a constant increase in our own senses of awareness and openness to different divergent perspectives, because whether we so when do we, where we are able to sort of the boundaries between someone who is trafficked and someone who is trafficking, someone who is the perpetrator and the victim, and so on and so forth, then our ability to actually effectively reimagine structures, incentives, feedback increase. So I'll stop here and would love to hear all your questions or thoughts or reactions to this.
Thanks, Supriya. So there were two interesting questions or thoughts that had come up. One from Krishna, to say that our systems necessarily always complete, or can they have missing elements? And the second one was from Aman on whether a system always has a positive direction, or could it be negative as well. I think on the negative one, all systems can have what we call maladaptation loops. That is, the negatives reinforce themselves. And in the absence of equal or opposing balancing forces, it's very possible for systems to end up straying very far from their purposes. I think, for example, if you look at policing as a system in the US, where the conversation currently is that the design of the police system versus where it's ended up at has been entirely broken, not because the foundational objectives were wrong, but because the system is in itself broken because the loops and the feedback loops have bad incentive structures. There are no delays or balancing loops, and the feedback is broken. So systems can definitely tend towards the negative. In fact, I would probably say that most of our systems currently are tending towards the negative. But the beauty is, because it's a system, and because we understand incentives, and because we understand where introducing delays can happen, and because we understand where introducing friction is appropriate, and because once in a while you'll find a leader who's able to transcend the very purpose of a system and help us move the norm on a system, you can change systems. The beauty about systems is because they're in motion, you can change them. On the thing about whether systems are always complete, Supriya, if you had thoughts.
No, I think I completely agree with you. I don't think there's any reason to believe it has to be designed for the good. And I thought that's why it's important to talk about, even terrorism as a system or crime as a system without you making an assumption that crime must not exist. So there is the good or bad is again our mental model, but it's not the system's mental model. There is nothing inherent in a system's design from a value judgment point of view. But again, going back to what Gautam said, there are usually two, three elements in the system that help perpetuate it, right? Like its self-organizing capability, its resilience, and its hierarchy help perpetuate it. So, for example, you can have a dictatorship, or you can have, you can take any example for that matter. But the reason it develops the ability to continue, whether it's a good or bad system, is typically if it has these three elements. Otherwise, it will be something that pops up very briefly and collapses. But if it is lasting for a fair amount of time, it's because it has the elements or the connections are resilient to some extent, have almost some self-organizing capability, and it can be for a seemingly like bad purpose, but equally some sense of hierarchy in it that helps maintain those roles and structures and components. So I definitely agree that I don't think that there needs to be it can definitely be negative, but I think most of us are trying to see where we can make it gear towards what we believe is to be positive. But to truth be told, even sometimes when we are driving positive change, you can have many unintended negative consequences also. So but I think again that comes down to we do what we know best. But the other question around system, Krishna, can you elaborate a bit more on that question? Are systems necessarily complete in themselves, or can they have missing? Can you elaborate a bit more what you mean by that?
Hey, Supriya. So thinking out loud, this actually relates to something else, that sort of discussion that started up on the chat alongside, which is basically where I was thinking of a system like patriarchy. And, I was thinking how within patriarchy, you have elements of dissent. So let's say the system of feminism or elements of feminism are dissenting elements within a structure of patriarchy. But these aren't necessarily structurally correlated to patriarchy. So do we in fact have overlapping systems where, the element of dissent is nested or it is housed in another system, but it overlaps here? So similarly, could you have, and I was thinking of a parallel being like language, where in a system like patriarchy, the language actually doesn't allow for expression of dissenting ideas. Not always. So it's, where then does that idea have a home? Which system does that idea have a home? So in my mind, I was just sort of grappling with this of overlapping systems, where sometimes you have bubbles where this something should exist here and it doesn't, versus, it exists elsewhere, but is then impinging on XYZ system.
Got it. I'll try my best, but would really love for anyone in the group to also sort of share how they have dealt with this. There definitely are overlapping systems by the very fact that our digestive system is a system, and then there's our body, and then there is like, the circulatory system. Like, and I think that goes back to the point that all our system is a system of systems, right? Like, and where we want to focus our eye on, like we want to focus it on the interconnection of one system to another, or we want to focus fully on one, however those boundaries are crossed, is definitely a process. But I find it always useful to go back to the body, because I think it handles like great clues to answer these questions, and then to see where we can go. Like, it's not the dissent in the context of our body can be in the form of a disease, or or of an like basically a cell that our body wants to repel is also equally a dissenting voice, but that doesn't necessarily is is outweighed by the remaining part of our body and its antibodies that are actually fighting things away, right? So I think what you're talking about patriarchy and like the role of dissent and certain dimensions of it certainly come from there. And if your goal is more or less to say I want patriarchy but with certain elements in it, then the question would be to sort of say for you, maybe what I might do is to map what are the elements in patriarchy that prevent dissent from happening. Is it a threat to status quo? Can we help those power dynamics maintain their power or not feel a threat with dissent? Or if that itself is fundamentally problematic, then it might require a far more structural change to sort of happen, right? If I go back to the original point of elements, interconnections, and purpose, and it's easiest to sort of like, I always find it easiest to take it to the simplest, lowest common denominator and then explore it from there. So for example, if you were to take a football team, you can say I'll replace one element with another, which is to say I'll replace X player with Y player, or I might replace all the players with the 11 people with another 11 people. You will have a change. You might have a better performing team or a worse performing team, but largely what you still have is a game of football, right? But if you change what would be the rules of the game or the interconnections between them, right? To say, if you change the rules from it being of football to basketball, then you no more have a basketball game. You have basically, you no more have a football game. You're watching basketball, and even more so if you change the purpose of the game. To say it is not about winning, but what if you change the purpose to say it's about losing, or if you change the purpose to say it's about every person having an equal time to sort of play, what you will actually see, the correlation of change is actually much stronger. So I think in essence, what I'm trying to say is if it is a system like patriarchy you're looking at, and if you see the component of dissent fundamentally in contradiction to the entire system, then just changing the elements of it might not make sense. There is some component of changing what I would call the interconnections between them. So the relationships, the values underlying it, the roles people play. Like for example, if no matter what our teachers are not performing, maybe at the end we need students to rate teachers and not maybe teachers rating students, right? Like when you do a change like that, it creates a much larger proportion of change, or when you change the purpose, than when you change the interrelations. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's at least a process of inquiry I would undergo. But I'm curious to know if anyone has a different take on this.
Thank you.
So perhaps one way of also looking at the idea of dissent is information flows, right? In a system, a lot is dependent on how information flows. Information flows are linked. Information flows are also linked to incentives. So in that worldview, I think the two things that would matter is, one is what the boundary we're drawing is, and like Supriya said, the boundary drawing, you can either call it arbitrary or contextual, but the boundaries are meant to facilitate a deeper inspection around the purpose of the discussion. So for every discussion, you could have different boundary conditions for the system we're talking about. And the boundary conditions will change because systems are dynamic. The boundary conditions are very much of our own making, and they can and should be reconsidered for every discussion, every problem, and every purpose. So these are dynamic conversations. I just want to bring in Anna here. Anna works with the Forum for the Futures in Bombay, and they do a lot of interesting work around thinking about society and social challenges through systems and systems models. We've had some interesting discussions, and part of this, reason we're having this discussion was it was a conversation she had chimed in on as well. And so I just want to ask Anna if she'd like to share some thoughts around the conversation, around the topic, and around the work they do. Anna?
Wow, thanks, Gautam. Thank you, Supriya. This is super interesting. And that makes me sound a lot more expert than I really feel, and also recognizes the fact that I do just stick my finger into conversations. Apologies about that. But I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for hosting. I guess, just a reflection on the conversation so far, I think I 100% agree with what you're saying, and everything seems to resonate from the experience we're having, not just here in India, but also in the work that we're doing elsewhere. but and yeah, I think it sort of plays out in practice basically. And the reason why I'm here really is to understand what the community is that is thinking in systems right now here. And we've had real problems trying to identify like who else is doing this. And it's just really, it's a real pleasure to be in a conversation and see so many faces that are indeed involved in it. Just on the question of dissent and patriarchy, we were having a conversation in the chat, sorry, I didn't mean it to be distracting, about nested systems. And I think when my colleagues have taught me about sort of understanding and conceptualizing systems, I find the nested systems model really helpful because it oh, sorry, I hope my internet will take this, because it just gives you the chance to play with the systems within the systems and acknowledge the fact that the nested systems don't necessarily have the same purposes, and that clash actually shapes the whole. And that's where I think kind of dissent can actually kind of shape the whole. And that's where we use the multi-level perspective to kind of try and pull out the elements that are kind of trying to shift the regime or the kind of business as usual. And that really helps me to understand and break apart the elements that are anti-system purpose versus kind of common or align with the business as usual. So if people don't use that model already, I would highly recommend it as something to have a look at. It's I can't remember actually who came up with it, but it's actually evolving as it comes. That's what's so good about this space, I think, is that it's not a locked down model, but there's a lot of discussion around how it needs to move. But it just talks about how the landscape, the regime, and the niche can come together to create quite fundamental shifts in systems. So it helps, yeah, it helps me understand that. But yeah, again, I think, thank you for hosting this, and totally agree with what you could say.
Yeah, but Krishna, just and I think you've left me the question I keep thinking about, but maybe like a way to also explore this is to really just understand dissent. Like maybe it's not about, I'm wondering like if it is just the process of seeing in your context might be to really see, see and understand dissent, what it means to different actors, from less from the abstract, but also as much from the lived realities, like of men, women, children, in the context of patriarchy. And to say, if you wanted to understand dissent, like before we even go to saying, what needs to change, but if we had to fully understand dissent, its reactions, its outcomes for different actors, can we maybe truly see that in its full pan? Can we, with as much an open mind, understand what dissent means to people that seem to be completely against it, what it rakes and evokes in them, and maybe it'll shed more insights into dimensions that we don't fully understand, and give clues to what actually might, either how it needs to be changed or what needs to be changed, whether it's a fundamental purpose value shift, or is it more incremental change of behavior nudges that are required.
Yeah. And I think that's where the intersection with empathic design and human-centered research really comes in when you're understanding the conditions within a system, because that's not something you can understand through a questionnaire, right? It's something you really need to go out and understand, and that's the kind of importance of having the duality of the big 10,000 foot picture with the right in the roots of behavior and mindsets.
Actually, if I could just pop in here. And Anna used a term in the chat, and I'm an ignoramus in this field, so I don't know whether it's actually a term that's used when you talk about system thinking. She was talking about unaligned elements. So I guess where I was sort of going with this is, so if you talk about, or if we talk about a dissenting element, maybe it appears as an element unaligned to the system under discussion, for example, patriarchy, but is actually a member of another system floating into this space, kind of like, a free radical ion floating in and out of, for lack of a better mind image. So, but does that make sense? I'm asking here from somebody who doesn't know much about this topic.
That totally makes sense, and an element that made dissent today might conform tomorrow. Like it's also like interesting to see that these are not, sometimes we correlate one is to see the value of the role of dissent as a whole. Sometimes we also attach it to, certain elements, dissent, and it seems to be for or against an element. But totally, I think where you're going with it at least feels correct to me. Like feels like a very feasible. Like, I mean, I can't see why not.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Supriya,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, Supriya, I have a question. So can you help us
could you just
understand?
identify yourself as well?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Gautam. Hi, I'm Saurav. I also work with Agami closely with Sue. And as Sue was speaking about system change, and it's such a thing that the more you learn, the more it's a never-ending process, right? And so I think two questions, Sue. Number one is it's more from an application point of view rather than the Donella Meadows philosophical way. Is number one is how does a systems change strategy, like if someone's leading from a systems lens, how does that strategy looks in real life? And I think that's one question. And the second thing is more the funding aspect. And today we are obsessed with and impact numbers, and usually that gets sold in the funding strategies and stuff like that. So is there a funding barrier today which limits systems change? Do you have any thoughts on that? That is today the philanthropic way of funding is quickly catching up to the systems angle, or today also social entrepreneurs are curating or making creative ways to pitch systems change in a much different way? So I think the question is number one is how does the system strategy looks in application in a strategy lens, and the second one is the funding aspect, because you work closely with them. So is there a funding like a funding problem today in terms of funding systems change?
My short answer for the second one, and we'll get to answer your first question in the next part of the segment. It's in what's in the doing of it. But definitely for me, the strategy of any systems change process, the first step is really to make sure you've identified the right problem or the right elements to begin with. So that's actually the first step of a problem. It's not something that predates it, and it's almost like a continuous part of the systems changing strategy or process is what are you seeing, what are you learning, what are you unlearning, and how are you understanding the system itself. And which is why I thought, for me, it's not a one-time mapping process, but it's the act of seeing without full judgment and looking at all the elements that actually is the first step of the strategy. What goes on from there, I will try covering a bit of it in the next part of the presentation, but obviously that's a full, there's a lot more to go there, and we can see if we need to have, but I'll allude to some of it in the second part. On your second question around funding, I personally haven't felt so. I don't think driving systems change is in contradiction with, it might be for some, but it's not the primary barrier. I think the bigger barrier we face is people being able to think and work systemically, and to for us to elevate ourselves to being system leaders. I think that's way harder than the funding question. So I don't mind, at least my personal experience as a funding isn't there. Funding barriers are a general thing, but I think the bigger barrier for systems change is systems leadership more than funding. That's my personal take, but I'd like to know if anyone's experience has been different.
Shreya, you had a question?
Hi, yeah, thank you. So I actually was sort of thinking on the lines of what Saurav had just raised. And I had come across this really interesting video of Zaid Hassan, who is a strategist and works on social labs revolution. So he was talking about systems and trying to identify like certain problems and break them down, and then also sort of suggest certain solutions in just like this really short video. So this is somewhat not exactly around funding, but a very interesting point that sort of resonated with me in that video was that he said that, planning has like a 90% rate of failure. And when we go about sort of doing our work, especially like I'll talk in context of like the social sector, the moment we get on to like planning a lot of things, that's exactly when we sort of, launch ourselves to failure. Or because then we become very predictive in our way of conduct and in our way of tackling a certain complex problem, especially at hand. So, I mean, I think this is more of like a general wondering that I would probably want to raise with group here that do you think that planning and systems thinking doesn't necessarily go hand in hand? And also I'm sort of drawing this from the previous information that you had shared, that how it was more of like an experiential learning and just knowing from day-to-day basis, and especially the story of I think it was Prasanta Tripathi that you had shared, that it was just like a really amazing example of how he sort of observed this pattern and then tried to sort of address this problem. If he had already gone with the plan probably to that tribal village, that okay, all what we need to do is probably in the span of the next 5 years set up a local PHC clinic that is efficiently providing services to the people in the village, then maybe I don't know, maybe that might have like impeded him to land upon the findings that he eventually did. So yeah,
I like what you're saying. I'll answer, at least I'll share what I think about it. I think the truth is we all forget, and I think that's why I was trying to highlight the duality principle, that we really forget that we all have our own mental models. Like we forget, we consider, each of ourselves consider ourselves to be so progressive, such liberal, such humanitarian, like whatever, like people who are out to there and are an asset, that we forget that we have our own mental models, and we forget that our models have emerged from the current system. I think that's the part that I was really trying to say, that we forget that our mental models, there are psychologists, I don't know what you all believe about like how the human mind learns, but we learn primarily through direct experiences, things that we see, we live, and we experience. And if we have lived and experienced this system that we are trying to change is a part of our own mental model, right? So if I just start from my own mental model without anything, and if I start planning with my mental model, which is anyway a part of the current system, my bets about changing the system are going to be really, really, really low, because because my mental model is a part of the system that I'm trying to change. So already it's bound to fail, which is why I feel like the first step is the ability to step outside your mental model. Now, how that happens can be through meeting people, having open, honest conversations. Some people do extreme things of going and living, like, people like Aruna Roy literally went and lived, in another reality to get out of her own mental model. Sometimes it can happen through literature, what you expose yourselves to, dialogues. But I think that is such a critical first step. And which is why planning before we do that, to me personally makes no sense. Now, if we have had experiences that have allowed us to step outside our own mental models and have insights, sure, plan. But I think for me, planning is not the death wish. It's getting attached to the plan that is the death wish. Basically, if you make a plan, it's okay. But if we get ideological and so attached to the plan that we can't be nimble with what we might be even learning along the way, then we have a problem. So I think we need some element of planning. It's really hard to work without it. But how you plan, how agile you are, how attached or detached you are to your plan is, I think, more important than planning itself.
Thanks.
Sorry. Okay. So just wanted to sort of make a submission here that I was also sort of like, while you were responding to this, like trying to connect it to the conversations just before, where talking about, for instance, the patriarchal conversation that was going on. I was sort of also trying to link it to a presence of certain value systems that we feel could essentially be imbibed in the larger scheme of systems or any other complex problem that sort of we're trying to address or solve. So I guess all of that makes sense, and our mental models are also possibly reflective of the same value systems in some of the other capacities. So maybe we also need to be wary of that. When we sort of get onto forming or in the process of at least formulating the system, it's not carrying like a really heavy personal bias of that group, maybe in a sense. But I guess it's like a really difficult thin line to tread along.
Yeah, totally.
Thanks, Shreya. So just the one point on funding for systems change, I think there are two challenges to solve for. One is what Supriya rightfully identified, of leaders who are able to understand and articulate systems and the need for change through the systems lens. The second thing is to be able to articulate, to take the funders on a journey as well, on the necessity for systems change, but also the fact that systems change isn't only a lag indicator, right? You don't have to wait. It's not give us money, wait for 5 years and hope. It's the fact that there are a series of things that happen in the short term that build up to the systems, quote unquote, systems change that you want. I think some of the wariness really has to do around what funders sometimes feel as a loss of control or a loss of visibility of what progress looks like, and being able to articulate what that progress looks like through the lens of long-term systemic change is important as well. And all of you on this call who work on normative shifts in systems or framework changes in systems, it's not like you don't do anything every day, right? You'll have a range of activities, work that ties into a theory of change that is embedded in a systemic construct. Being able to articulate that is important. I'll hand back to Supriya to take us home.
Yeah, thanks for that addition, Gautam. I'll just go back to sharing my screen, and where are we? Yeah. So just to sort of close the loop on that, like something that I found, and this was I know you and I were having that conversation on Slack, but one way to sort of drill it down, like I think the essential is what we spoke about before, like really the act of seeing. But I find it useful to also go, and this is a framework that I learned while I was at Ashoka, is to distinguish between the material and systemic problem. Like, when we just say what we see, what meets the eye, it's the material problem. But a systemic problem gives us, almost indicates to me, and this is very useful even for a funder or anyone you're working with to hear, is what are you seeing in the system that is unique, right? Like, which gives you a clue into the opportunity for action. For example, like I'm not put data points here, but if you were to broadly say youth employment, unemployment rate is high, all these training processes are not working, there are this many millions, only this many jobs. Sure, you get a sense of what is like the outcome or like the magnanimity of that problem. But if you were to articulate, as I've heard a social entrepreneur articulate, this is Priya Agarwal from Antanan, like she basically was telling me the distinction between skilling and career, because she said she observed that most of the young people who go to these skilling processes are taught to be a carpenter, whatever, like different things, but most of them drop out very soon. Now you can observe the behavior of dropping out and find 20 reasons why it might and how you can improve retention rates. And she found that most people drop out before the skilling program ends. But she said when she spoke to the young people, what she understood, what they were really looking for is careers, and basically something that meets their interests, not to be able to do, carpentry, no matter what they cared about. And then her entire system and solution is designed around working from using their aspirations and skills as a starting point to then see what they must do and where they must be rooted, in contrast to just saying, here is what every person in the planet needs to do, right? So that's one way of articulating. I thought I'd share what we came at, and I'll share the 2-3 levels, right? Like from Agami's point of view, like you can articulate the problem at like X million people don't have access to judges, no legal literacy, things are not affordable. But what we kept observing was actually a deeper problem, which was a deep sense of paralysis. Because when we were beginning and we were meeting like every judge, lawyer, mostly everyone just laughed us off, said nothing can happen, including like people who were chief justice of court said, yeah, all these ideas are great. I tried doing it, I couldn't. What makes you think you can? Most of our friends told us like nothing's going to happen. You're some dreamy person. And for us, because it was not like people couldn't think of the solution, people could, but the greater problem was the sense of paralysis, people not knowing where to intervene, what they can do, like there was no pathway to action because the system was so opaque and insular. And we realized that that was actually what we primarily needed to solve for. And it was not about one solution or idea, but at the heart, we will measure that is what we need to change. But I can't talk about that in the abstract. Like when it comes down to what we do, I can't simply say we need more participation, we shouldn't feel paralyzed. but everything we do in some way, consciously or subconsciously, tackles that. It doesn't matter. We might not go around blowing the trumpet that this is the problem we are solving, because you're completely right. It can seem like a bit fluffy and like, abstract to talk about. But whether we started the prize or the summit as a space to create an optimistic voice, like we decided that we will take an optimistic voice to the sector, because the sector needs that more than anything else. So everything is showcasing on what can be done, who's doing what, etc. But equally in creating pathways for action, because people feel so paralyzed, they don't know where to begin and where to start, to say how many entry points can we create for people to work either with the system or with each other. Fine, if we can't change the courts, what can we change? Can we look at, so people have been looking at pendency in courts for a really long time, to say, fine, let's have online dispute resolution, which is something that we all can do no matter what, whether or not the courts respond, we can all resolve dispute in a collaborative way, not go adversarial and do it. So to create pathways for action is what we decided to focus on, using live specific examples from within the broader system. So that's where we landed at for ourselves, looking at this broad system, as I had mentioned right up front in the beginning. But I think some questions I find useful going into, like when we are seeing these things, right? Like while we are seeing, what are good questions to reflect upon? Really to ask ourselves, what is the goal or purpose of the system as we're seeing it? Is sometimes even the stated goal can be problematic. While I did mention, look at what is the behavior-led purpose, sometimes even the stated goal can be problematic. So for example, many universities will talk to you about saying, oh, it's about you getting a job. Maybe that shouldn't be the stated goal of a university system. Maybe it should be something else. So sometimes the stated goal itself requires need. Sometimes the goal otherwise in terms of behavior needs to be relooked at. I found it useful to constantly ask myself, how is the system I am looking at structured? To sort of see what are the hierarchies, what is the elements in which communication flows, who has what, like looking at the structure of the system is something I find fascinating. Like for example, in the judiciary context, we need to completely internalize that the system has, is like they're first amongst equals, like, it is structured like that. And we need to reimagine all our solutions, keeping either that structure in mind or, explore other dimensions. But I gave a very little example, but you can see structure, including in the way Osama bin Laden looked at structure, right? Who are its agents, decision makers? This is a useful thing to sort of reflect upon constantly. And the fourth question is often the gold mine for me, is what are the underlying values? I think Krishna, I don't know if it was Krishna or someone was talking about it. Looking at the making stated and obvious what the underlying values are. I'll give you a recent example. We were looking at the issue of bail, and all of us have been looking at sorting bail and all the related problems it creates, because we have 70% of our population, under trial population in prison. That results in a multifold economic, emotional, and mental costs to both the people in prison and outside, leave alone the budgetary costs for the state and taxpayers. But we were trying to sort of say, oh, does it mean we have to make sure there's pro bono legal aid? Should we make sure there is more, there are many ways you can fix that problem. But we realized the underlying value of distrust was again actually what the heart of the problem was. And we realized there is absolutely no evidence to show that a person needs to be put in jail to make sure they cooperate with the criminal justice system. Like there is actually no research to show that. In fact, there's contrary research available. So when we looked at the system and the underlying value that I will put you in prison till you, there's more nuance, I'm oversimplifying it here, but we realize that the value of trust is actually the deeper problem. Similarly, you can extend that same thing around human relationships, motivations, capability, roles, what is success, what is failure, incentives, and all of that. I think the more we reflect on seeing these elements, the more clues we get to where our pathways to action might be. I'll quickly run into what we do about the problem we see. We don't have enough time to cover it fully, and we're at 5 minutes, but broadly, this is again a very, very, very useful framework that I found that Ashoka created. Into saying that, just because I have identified a system problem or a systemic problem or an insight doesn't necessarily mean I will scale my change. Now, this is without any judgment whether we must scale or not. Like if we treat the body as a system, if I change my own body, I can technically say I've changed the system. But if we are talking about saying, okay, assuming we want to have a boundary that is larger than that, then there are 4 different ways you can go about once you have the insight. So if you take Prashant and Tripathi's example of saying, I see a sense of fatalism in children, amongst mothers, and a lack of critical thinking skill, the first thing he can do, for example, can be just to say, I will train X number of women to be able to have critical thinking skills directly as an organization or whatever. Or then he can go on to say, I will train X million people, like 10 million people. So, I want to do lots of it, but I will do it directly. The underlying thing then he can look at is to say, what are the elements in the system that if he does, and a very simple way I find sometimes a reference point is how do you make sure this idea or change lives outside your own organization, right? What are the tweaks you might need to make? For example, one person that I know who was working in the field of disability, like he figured that caregivers have his insight, like what he saw was caregivers face as much mental health issues, depression or lack of employment as much as a person with disability. And so he basically decided that instead of doing any direct service or lots of direct service, so instead of going caregiver by caregiver, organizing them and supporting them, what he did was connected with the top 4 funders in the world working on disability, convince them that whenever you fund any work around disability, also fund component of work with caregivers. He embedded working with caregivers as a program within NGOs. So basically to make sure that the idea in some way lives outside and in different components than something that he is directly like doing one-on-one service for. And last is what is called framework change, where basically the reference point for framework change is really simple, that the change has happened to such an extent that now if you are not doing that, you are the outlier, right? Like for example, today to some extent, you can say that to some extent, but not everywhere, in some parts of the world, if you are a racist, you are now called a racist, in contrast to what it was maybe like 100 years ago, where, it was normal for everyone to be a racist. Like where it has sort of tipped it the other way is when we would sort of talk about it as having framework change happen, where you have fundamentally changed the mindset at a society level, where what is the norm has sort of tipped to being on the other side. Gautam, is it okay if I take a couple of more minutes? I'll try wrapping it up super quick.
Yes, by all means.
So I think like a question might be useful to ask ourselves is, what am I trying to scale? Am I trying to scale or change a mindset? And you can look at scale at whatever level you want, right? It can be at a city level, state level, country level, whatever level. But is it a mindset you're trying to change? Because then your strategy, having clarity on this, I think helps sort of answer your question a lot on what the strategy must be. Because I might have identified a systemic problem, but I might only want to do it through my organization, or I might want to do it through a program or service, or I might want to scale what is called a set of principles. Design thinking is an incredible example of that, right? Like design thinking is basically a set of principles, ideas created that, but how it has scaled is as a set of principles or way of working, not necessarily, I mean, they've also grown as an organization, but it has sort of like scaled as a set of principles. Or is it an idea or an insight you want to change? The example I gave about the caregivers, he wanted to scale the idea, not necessarily a program or a service, and he found the pathways of doing that. Or do you want to create a whole new system? Like microfinance is a good example of it, right? Like, is what you're imagining a complete parallel, different, radically new system? It can be either a parallel system or a system or a re-engineering of the existing system. Like, for example, like what the Right to Information movement or like the act was, right? Like in a way, turning what we knew about the system, making a fundamental shift in how it works. Or it can be at a mindset level, which is, say, the literacy movement was at a mindset level, to just believe that everyone can be educated and must be educated, it may seem like an obvious thing, but was not always the case. There was a time when people thought only people from a certain class or community can ever learn. But today, that's not something we question. We all take it for granted that, sure, everyone can learn. The question is more how, right? But that tipping of scales, each of these lend themselves to completely different strategies, which will be a point of another conversation. But I find it always useful to gain clarity on this. Going back on this, one thing I want to abundantly clarify is nobody is ever clearly in one bucket. Almost everyone employs combinations of strategies. Like you will do some direct service to get a better understanding of, processes. It's not like Muhammad Yunus didn't do direct service or lots of direct service to achieve systems change, right? And these are not linear processes. It doesn't mean you have to start with direct service and then go to lots of direct and then to system. Someone like Martin Luther King started with framework change by saying, I have a dream. And then, there were elements that happened along the way that resulted in a system change. So they're not necessarily linear processes or strictly compartmentalized to say one person has to only work in one component. But it's useful to know where you want to play at and what elements of your strategy will lend to what level of change, just so you have clarity for yourself, for people you're working with, and even your funders if they are, but along those contexts. So I find like this as a useful listening to say, where do we want to put a proportion of our efforts along each of these lines? If for the first time I did it for ourselves, honestly, as Agami yesterday while making this presentation, and this is a rough proportion that I put forth for ourselves, right? Like I think our version of direct service, we may be spending this much of our time here. We might be doing 50% of our effort here. We might be looking, the story we want to tell is more around optimism, that mindset that we want to change. So it's just an element. Now we can debate whether some of it is it, not it. We are also living and learning, but I find this a useful exercise to do just so we gain clarity on where and how we want to carve our own paths going forward. But that's that. I'll stop here and we'll be back to hearing some questions since we're at time, or any thoughts that you all have.
Thanks, Supriya. I know we're over time, but for those of you who can stay, we're happy to have a little bit of a conversation. If there are things you want to talk about, again, questions welcome. None of us have the answers, but this is a conversation that we'd like definitely to be a part of.
May I? This is a slightly pedantic question. What's the difference between direct service and lots of direct service?
It's literally the scale of it.
Okay.
So if I want to teach 1,000 kids, it would be direct service. If I want to teach 1 million, it would be lots of direct service. Mainly, we distinguish it because the strategy to do one and the second is very different. Usually, you can't scale what you did for 1,000 kids to do you can't go about it the same way. You may be able to scale the pedagogy or the curriculum, but how you go about delivering it changes radically when you're doing lots of direct service or when you're doing direct service. So, for example, most organizations you see when they want to go to lots of direct service, they'll start building partnerships with others. They'll start going into a training the trainer process. They'll employ different methods. So the classification of the four mainly is because the how-to of achieving it is very different for each. If I want to focus on frame change, mindset change, what I need to do is very different from what I need to do if I'm doing systems. The strategies are different. So that's why they compartmentalize differently.
Awesome. Understood. Thank you.
If there's anyone who wants to, Anu, any thoughts, any questions, any comments?
Happy to hear Anu's voice, given this all started because of
yeah.
No, I was just gonna say this has been. I think it was good just hearing everyone else's thoughts on it. I think my biggest takeaway is that it's kind of an evolving thing, and the person who is doing the change sort of defines the system and the changes within the system. I think that was my biggest takeaway, actually.
So how has your journey particularly around the ecosystem around the lakes, on food? How has that journey been progressing? I mean, we'd just love to hear about how that's going.
Yeah, actually, so we've been working on, and we kind of came to the same conclusion actually, because we did this exercise and then it went all over the place. And then we were like, well, this doesn't make sense. We're not gonna, because everything is connected to everything. And so we kind of also came to the conclusion, okay, we're gonna define our system in this way. And the other thing that I took away from this is, Supriya, the way you look at systems is also, there's one goal that might be this large stated, I think you called it a material problem, but really the systemic problem, I saw it as the ways in which that problem can, or the problems with reaching that that thing, or that's what I saw it as. Like there might be like 50 things that need to be done in order to increase skilling, for example. But then the systemic problem you've described is, hey, there's these two ways, there's these two sub-problems to reach that thing, and that's how we're describing our system is solving these two sub-problems. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, no, and I think you will always see there are many causes to a problem, but I think it is interesting to always see what is like almost like the underlying cause to that problem, right? Like, so for example, and it really depends. So even if you say something which is the most obvious thing, access is a problem, right? Like it might be the most stated thing, but what have you discovered around why? Because
right, why is that there?
Because it's also like this, right? Most of us come into this, actually that's the biggest thing. Most of us come into this because we're deeply dissatisfied with status quo, right? And then we also have enough reason to believe how people have done it before largely hasn't resulted in solving the problem, right? Like that would be a fairly fair assumption to make, because there's something about how it has happened so far that hasn't resulted in status quo changing. Now, either you can say, hey, no, it just needs many more of us doing the exact same thing. And that's actually, the problem is actually not enough of us are doing that same very thing. And that's one way to go about it. But the other way of going about it is to think, what can I do differently that will create different results from what our predecessors have done? Because, and in that sense is why I like the seeing dimension one step more, because it forces us to see either the how we want to do it to be radically different, or the what we want to focus on, assuming that we'll create different consequences or outcomes from our predecessors.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, thank you all for staying with us. I hope this was interesting. I learned a lot. We're hoping to do another one around the trickier question of measuring progress in systems change. On that one, we have even more questions than answers, but it's a good one because I think we're all struggling with this, whether we're change makers, whether we're active participants, whether we're ecosystem builders, whether we're funders. We're all deeply aligned to the idea that systemic change is necessary, but sometimes the question then is, how do we hold ourselves accountable to that, and how do we measure our progress on that? We'll hopefully do that in a few weeks, and we'll keep you all posted. We'll send out a video of this recording to everyone. Thanks so much for your time. Thank you, Supriya. Really, thank you for putting this together for us. We learned a lot, and I know everyone is grateful as they're chiming in on the chat. If you all need to reach out to Supriya, she's super active now on Slack. It only took 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that problem I had. Yeah, but no, this is a topic close to my heart. I'm just curious to continuously learn more about this. So happy to just think through with any of you and brainstorm whenever you want, or put you in touch with people who might know. Many of you in this room have actually got like way more expertise, and I've like learned from so many of you. So really excited to see you all here and find the opportunity to synthesize these thoughts. Otherwise, these things stay somewhere in your head, but this really gave me the opportunity to put it together and also discover what I think. So thank you for that.
Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely evening.